Hello everyone, my name is David Kiernan. I'm a Curriculum Officer at NCFE, and you're very welcome to today's webinar, which is for the Level 1 and Level 2 Technical Award in Interactive Media, focusing on Unit 2. And I'm joined today as well by Leslie Davis, one of our external quality assurers and a subject specialist in interactive media. And the plan for today's webinar is to first give an overview of the VCERT qualification, in case there's anyone who's brand new who is not familiar with it. We'll also give you a summary of the learning outcomes and grading descriptors for Unit 2. Leslie Davis is going to walk us through and show us some learner work. And also then, any questions that you have, please do ask them. And we want you to ask them throughout this entire webinar, as we will be stopping at different points to answer the questions. I will also provide an update in case anyone here has been affected by COVID-19 and the whole teacher assessed grade system. I'll give a little update on that as well. First, just a little poll. How do you feel about Unit 2 of interactive media, the assessing, the grading, and so on? How confident would you put yourself? 1 being not very confident to 10, incredibly confident. Okay, getting some votes. It looks like the 1 to 2 range for Unit 2. I'll leave it up for another 20 seconds or so. Okay, 1 to 2 and 5 to 6s seem to be where people are at. Okay, well, hopefully this will help clear up anything that you're not sure about, and do ask questions. You should see a question box at the side, and as well as that, you can actually download the slides that we're going to go through. In that control panel from GoToWebinar, where the questions are, there should also be another section that says handouts. In there is today's slides that you can download, including the learner work. But first, a little overview about this technical award. And I did say it's going to be a brief overview. If you need anything more comprehensive, then we do have induction webinars every month regarding these, and they're also on our YouTube channel as well. So the Level 1 and Level 2 Technical Award in Interactive Media consists of 2 assessment components. There's an external assessment worth 40% of the final grade, and the internally assessed coursework, and that's worth 60%. Interactive media itself has got 4 mandatory units. Each unit is internally assessed with the internally assessed tasks that we have, but each unit is also externally assessed. The content and specification that's in those 4 units does appear on the external assessment as well. Since we're focusing on internal assessments today, learners are entitled to 1 resubmission of the internally assessed coursework following the external quality assurer visit. If your learners are on the Level 2 Technical Award in Interactive Media, then do bear in mind that they will need to achieve a minimum of a Level 2 pass in each internal assessment, so all 4 internal assessments, and a Level 2 pass in the external assessment as well. Now, your primary go-to is going to be qualhub.co.uk. On here, you'll be able to find the specification, assessment materials, resources, and so much more. So on the search bar, you can just type in interactive media. If you know the qual code, that's fine, or even just start putting in Level 2 Technical Award in, and it'll come up with a list of suggestions. And as I said, there's lots of stuff on there, support material, specification, teaching material, but we're going to focus on the internal assessments because we have made some internal assessments, some assignments for you to use, and they are on the Interactive Media QualHub page. So on the page, you'll see a tab that says Assessment Materials, and there they are, Internal Assessment Sample Tasks. So it can be quite useful. And when you look at these, the first thing, and this example here is for Unit 1, the first thing you'll notice there is a scenario. These are there to designed to give a real life situation, help set the assignment in context. You may want to change this though, so it's more suitably contextualized for your learners. After that, the assignment goes into some further details about specific information that the learners would need to include. And then different ways that the evidence could be presented. And we do try to keep this as open as possible, from leaflets, PowerPoints, and so on. Seems to be PowerPoint presentation seems to be quite a keen and useful way of doing it. But again, it's as open. And the other thing that's on there is the grading descriptors. So these are what the learners will need to do to get a pass, merit, and distinction. They'll be on there. It's what the assessors are going to be using when marking them. It's what an external quality assurer is going to be checking when they come out. Now, in terms of the grading of these 4 internally assessed units, each unit has either 3 or 4 learning outcomes, and each learning outcome is graded. So for Unit 1, for example, we will be focusing on Unit 2 today. I'm just using Unit 1 as an example. There are those 3 learning outcomes: learning outcome 1, learning outcome 2, learning outcome 3. So learners get graded on each learning outcome. Now, in order to judge the unit as a certain grade, learners have to have the same level of competency, minimum level of competency in each learning outcome if we're to say the unit is that grade as well. So if they were to get a pass overall for Unit 1, they need at least a pass in each learning outcome. A merit overall for the unit, they need a merit in each learning outcome. So in this case, the merit has a pass in learning outcome 1, merit in the other 2. The overall grade is for the unit is going to be a pass. In order for them to get a merit overall, they need a merit in learning outcome 1. When it comes to combining and working out their final grade, there is a compensatory system there. So if they got in Unit 1 a pass, Unit 2 a distinction, Unit 3 a distinction, Unit 4 a distinction, their final grade would not be a pass. There is a compensatory grading system when you're combining all the units together. Now, in terms of COVID-19 and the situation there, because many centres, possibly yourselves if you're delivering as well, will have been affected by some extent to it, and I want to give you a little update on that. So Ofqual did publish their VCRF, the Vocational and Technical Qualification Contingency Regulatory Framework. This is why we say VCRF, it's quite a mouthful, which is the framework to awarding for vocational qualifications. And as an overview for this qualification is in line for teacher assessed grades, or tags. But do try and continue with the internal assessments wherever possible. That's very key. For the external assessments, they have been cancelled for this academic year, the ones that are happening in the summer. The one that happened in January, that was left as optional because it happened in January, and when we went into lockdown on January 4th, that was kept open as it was for any of those external assessments that were happening in January. So centres could choose either to enter the learners or not. It was down to you. But in terms of the summer one, definitely cancelled, and it would be assessed by a teacher assessed grade. Now, if your learner for the external assessment already has a banked external assessment grade, or maybe they got a CAG, the centre assessed grade from which was being offered last academic year, then you don't need to submit a tag. You might want to though, if they're entitled to a resit, then a tag could be submitted for that external assessment. But if they already have a banked external assessment grade, then a resit or a tag doesn't need to be submitted. For internal assessments, that also applies. If your learners have any banked internal assessment grades, like if you're currently got year 11s and maybe they got Unit 1 and 2 done last year, it was checked, it's banked, that's fine. No tag needs to be submitted unless they were going to do a resubmission, then it is in line for tags as well. Now, any tags though, teacher assessed grades, need to be based on evidence. So this is why it's important that you do continue with the internal assessments and gather as much evidence as possible. Where CAGs last year could have been a prediction to a certain extent of how well you think a learner might have done, these ones have to be based on the evidence. Doesn't mean they have to have the units complete. You might be able to supplement with other evidence. For example, there are some units in interactive media where the learning outcomes are quite similar, so the evidence might be similar, that could be linked together. There might be classwork or homework that you've set, even any work that was set when learners were at home, remote learning was happening, that could be applicable as well, but you do need the evidence there. If any of you have mid-flight learners, such as a learner in the first year of a 2-year course, or if you're delivering if you've got a 3-year delivery model, that'd be learners in the first or second year of that 3-year course. In other words, usually learners in year 9, year 10, things like that, they can actually have tags submitted as well. So that would be for any assessments they would have completed this academic year. And I do mean any assessments, be that internal assessments or external assessments. Again, must be based on evidence. Doesn't have to be complete assessments, but it has to be based on evidence. And the deadline for submitting tags are going to be mid-June. We're hoping to have that date finalized next week. We should be announcing that, but mid-June. Best thing if you're going down any tag route is seek guidance from your EQA. If you're not sure about evidence, they're going to be a valuable resource. They're going to be very busy this year, so definitely seek out support and guidance from them. Okay. So that was a brief overview, and I'm just going to check to see if there's any questions before we look at some of the specifics to do with Interactive Media Unit 2. Okay. No questions at the minute. If you do have any questions, do pop them into that question box. But at this point, I will hand over to Leslie, who's going to go through Unit 2 and the individual learning outcomes for it.
Thanks, David. Hi, everyone. Welcome this afternoon to this webinar for Unit 2. It's good to have you here. So what we'll do is we'll go through each of the learning outcomes, and then there is an example of a past learner's work at the end of going through the learning outcomes, and also of a merit piece of learner work. So hopefully you'll find this useful. And also just to remind you to download the materials before you actually leave the webinar, because they're really useful for you to be able to take a look at the learner work in a bit more detail and at your own pace with the assessment criteria. Because after these discussions on the learning outcomes, we do tend to go through the work quite quickly, and there's quite a few pages of that work today for this particular unit. So Unit 2, this is one of the larger units, just because it has 4 learning outcomes, and it's been designed to follow on from Unit 1. However, that's not mandatory. You can deliver the units in different orders, but the logical approach is to deliver Unit 1 first, as that's very much an introductory unit, and then Unit 2, which is about planning and preparing for an interactive media product. And it makes sense also to deliver this unit prior to Unit 3, where they actually create a product. Some of you might have been on the webinar that we delivered last week. If not, that's available on the YouTube channel. But ideally, this plan and preparation work should be for the product that learners produce in Unit 3. Again, just to minimise the amount of sort of multiple projects happening, and make sure that it's the units are providing opportunities for learners to submit purposeful evidence here for the internal assessment. So the 4 learning outcomes here are: understand how to produce a proposal to meet a brief, produce a proposal meeting the requirements of a brief, produce planning for interactive media products, meeting the requirements of the brief and proposal, and reviewing the proposal and the planning of an interactive media product. So quite a lot to do in this unit. So the first learning outcome 1, this is about learners' understanding of what is required to produce a proposal for an interactive media product to meet a given brief. Now, just to remind centres that it's the assessor that will provide this brief to the learners via the internal assessment. So this isn't something that's provided to you by NCFE. However, there is some examples that David illustrated before. He's shown us how to actually access those on the Qual Hub section of the NCFE website. So there is examples for every internally assessed unit, so please do access those. Even if you only use them as a starting point, they are really a good reference to ensure that you include the right types of tasks to allow learners to target and achieve all assessment criteria. So it's up to centres how they wish to deliver this content. You may want to split this into a series of formal lessons or practical workshops, or you may want to combine delivery with guest speakers or other relevant activities. Once the unit content has been delivered, learners will then need to be set an internal assessment task to demonstrate their understanding of this content. And remember that this learning outcome is focused on meeting a brief, so learners must be given an appropriate brief to respond to here. It's also important to understand that learners must produce evidence for internal assessment within this learning outcome, within their portfolio of evidence that they submit. So we would expect to see some examples here of proposals to demonstrate their understanding. And then there's 5 assessment points here that they need to demonstrate understanding of that you can see on screen here. So we've got ideas development, the audience, technical aspects, design aspects, and content. And it's these assessment points, these bullets, that need to be evidenced in the assignment assessment evidence for learning outcome 1. So here we can see the level 2 assessment criteria, and it's good to mention here that the focus of assessment is learners' understanding of what is required in a proposal. So they won't actually create a proposal at this stage, as this is covered in the evidence required for learning outcome 2. So at a pass level, they need to describe each assessment point. So that was those previous bullet points on the previous slide, which were ideas development, who the audience is, what are the technical aspects, design aspects, and content. So they will need to describe each of those to achieve a pass. And again, they can use examples where relevant. For a merit, they need to make some links between the aspects, as illustrated in the example here on the right-hand side on this assessment grid. And then for a distinction, they need to make links between aspects and explain the impact of these links. So an example here, learners may explain how poor content or a certain navigation style could positively or negatively impact on the user target audience, and that's all part of that, those elements of that proposal. So the expectation of this learning outcome is based on learners' understanding of the importance of each of those assessment points, each of those important elements that form a proposal document. And when we say proposal document here, it could be a Word document, it could be a PowerPoint presentation, whichever method that learners want to create that proposal in. And here we can see the level 1 assessment criteria. Quite basic evidence is required here. For a pass, it's identifying obvious points, identify relevant points for a merit, and identify points with explanation for a distinction. And evidence for identify could be a list here, or it could be bullet points. So we're not looking for a great deal of evidence for identify at level 1. And for the distinction, they must have some explanation, but still this can be quite basic. So an example could be a student might write, I will need to provide content for my website. So they've got a purpose there. The brief could have been to design a website. The content is relating to the assessment point, and that meets the needs of teenagers or the relevant target audience that the brief presented. So they may say something like, I will need to provide content for my website that meets the needs of teenagers. And that's based on the information that they've been given on that brief. And I'm just going to pause for any questions based on Learning Outcome 1 before we move on to Learning Outcome 2.
No questions have come in at the minute, so good to go on to learning outcome 2.
Okay, thank you. So learning outcome 2, so as touched on briefly in learning outcome 1, this is the part of the unit that learners will produce the proposal. So they've got some understanding now of what's required to be in that proposal from learning outcome 1, and now this is where they will actually create a proposal based on the requirements of a brief. And again, that's the brief that the assessors have provided learners with. So it's about applying what they found out in learning outcome 1 to produce their own proposal. They will also use the same assessment points as reference. So again, we can see those stated here, repeated. So it's ideas, audience, technical aspects, design aspects, and content. Again, it's up to centres how they wish to deliver and assess the content of this learning outcome. However, the most logical approach would be to allow learners to do this in a series of practical workshops that they could be facilitated by the assessor. And access to digital resources is also best practice, but this is not mandatory. So if learners want to do this purely using physical resources, then that's absolutely fine. We do say best practice for digital, as it just, some learners prefer to be using things like word processing applications, PowerPoint, or even they may want to do in another package as well. And that's absolutely fine. So here we can see the level 2 assessment criteria, and you will see that the assessment criteria relies on how well learners respond to problems that would have been interpreted from the given brief. So for example, they will use the given brief and that information to plan their own responses within their proposal. So they may identify a straightforward problem at pass level, for example, resources that they don't have access to. At a merit, they would attempt to solve a straightforward problem. So using this same problem, they may have to acquire additional resources or use an existing asset if they cannot create their own. And at a distinction, we would expect to see a clear proposal that meets the brief for all of those assessment points. And at this stage, learners will have an explanation of what a proposal is based on their work in learning outcome 1 and their own proposal in response to a given brief for this learning outcome 2. So it's two-part here with the same assessment points. And here we can see the level 1 assessment criteria. Again, the focus is on meeting the brief and how well learners produce a valid and relevant proposal with the inclusion of the associated assessment points. So there's always a link between those assessment points, that's the content that they talk about in learning outcome 1. This is what's involved for a proposal, and then they actually create a proposal of their own to propose a product for learning outcome 2. And again, I'll just pause before I move on, David, to see if there's any questions come in for learning outcome 2.
Yeah, let's have a quick look and see. No, there doesn't seem to be any more questions at the minute. So it looks like we're good to go on.
We'll continue with learning outcome 3. So learning outcome 3 requires learners to proceed with the planning for their proposed product in learning outcome 2. So we can see here the assessment points are project planning to meet the criteria of the brief. So that's the given brief from the assessor to the learner. Use of recognised design processes. Use of recognised design processes for functionality and appearance. So it's slightly higher demand there for level 2. And the selection of assets, and that is just a level 2 assessment point only. So we can see that the difference between level 1 and level 2 with regard to the planning evidence required. So level 2, we can see learners are required to evidence 3 areas, whilst level 1 are required to evidence just 2 areas. So for the first assessment point here, learners could have a general plan. Usually we see a table here with activities listed and timings of those activities, and that's sort of the least sort of lower end evidence that we would expect here. This plan should also include stages of the production of the creation of the product, including a review at the end. For the second assessment point, recognised processes, these are listed as examples in the unit specification, and this is what we would expect for this subject and level. So some examples of these are wireframes, storyboards, navigation charts, mind maps, plans, timescale, sketches, mood boards, colour combinations, could be samples of typography as well. But it's important to note here that the level 2 design processes must also focus on the functionality and appearance of the product. So we would expect to see some sort of planning regarding the functionality, you know, the sort of aesthetics of how something's going to look, as well as how that's going to function. So they might have a navigation chart there for level 2. That would be required to sort of be able to assess how these plans have actually catered for the functionality. And then the final assessment point here refers to the selection of assets, and learners can create their own assets or they can acquire these using existing assets. So they don't have to create everything themselves. However, they may want to take some photographs, or they might want to use their own sort of logo designs, this type of thing, that's fine. The same goes for like video or audio assets there. So they can create their own or they can use existing. It should be noted here though, that if learners do use existing assets, they do need to prepare these effectively so they will work and function within their own product. So for example, they may need to edit an image and save it in an appropriate format in order for it to be viewed on a web page. So here we can see the level 2 assessment criteria. We can see the focus again is on planning the product as it focuses on meeting the brief as well as their own proposal. So it should follow on quite nicely from the proposal learning outcome 2, and this is the evidence that they will produce, the planning evidence here. So there's also focus on how well the learners respond and resolve any problems encountered, and these can be linked to those identified within the proposal. Also important to realise that as learners are planning, they may come across further problems, for example, acquiring suitable assets, and it is how they manage this process, manage these problem solving within the planning documentation to ensure that they can proceed with producing the product. A good way to do this is a reflective journal or annotated screenshots, or it could be actually having an image of or a photograph of some planning documentation in a PowerPoint and actually putting some speaker notes underneath of any problems encountered there. But a reflective journal is a good way to record this process. It comes quite natural for learners to actually then respond to any problems that they encounter as they're actually creating that planning documentation. And here we can see the level 1 assessment criteria, and there's still a focus on meeting the brief, but also applying the skills associated with planning the product. And I'll just pause again to see if there's any questions, David, for this learning outcome 3.
Yeah, just going to have a look now. Let's have a look. I'm not seeing any questions at the minute. Again, I had this issue yesterday. I wanted someone just to type something into the chat box so I could make sure it's working. Hopefully it is, the question box, but hopefully it's just straightforward like the graphic design was yesterday as well. So no questions at this point.
Okay, that's fine. So we'll move on to learning outcome 4. So Learning Outcome 4 requires learners to review the proposal that they've created in Learning Outcome 2 and also review the planning that they've created in Learning Outcome 3. So it's a two-part review here of two parts, two other learning outcomes. So there's also some difference between level 1 and level 2 with regard to the review evidence required. And again, that's illustrated by these assessment points on the screen here. So for level 2, we can see learners are required to evidence the consideration of 6 areas, whilst level 1 learners are required to evidence just 2 areas. However, even though 6 areas does seem quite a lot for this review, they are reviewing the proposal as well as the planning documentation. However, the focus here, you'll notice, is learner must consider. So we're not looking for an evaluation, if you like, of every point. There needs to be a consideration. And you know, they might write a little bit more, or if they're doing a presentation, they might talk a little bit more about one assessment point more than the other, and that's absolutely fine. So there needs to be a consideration of all of these areas, but it does not need to be an evaluation in any great detail. And then just an additional note on feedback here. So this could be feedback from their tutor, it could be from individuals, it could be from the whole group, the whole class, any audience or any feedback. It could be online feedback if they've done maybe a small survey, is absolutely fine as well. What we do ask though is the method of feedback that learners have used is included within this evidence for this learning outcome review. So here we can see the level 2 assessment criteria. Quite straightforward, as the learning outcome requires consideration. So again, just to ensure that it's not a huge evaluation of these areas that we're looking for here. So we can see that it clearly states how this consideration relates to the pass, merit and distinction criteria. And all of this is only, even at a distinction, the emphasis is on describe. So that it's not evaluate, it's not analyse, it's describe, even at the higher level distinction there. But again, it's always twofold at level 2. It's looking at the proposal and the planning processes. And you'll notice here at the distinction level, there's quite a difference that's underlined here. So for level 2 learners aiming towards distinction, within that review, they also need to include any opportunities for improvement. So without that additional evidence of what they might do to improve the planning documentation, improve the proposal, they wouldn't be able to achieve a distinction, and that grade would either be limited at a pass or a merit. And here we can see the level 1 assessment criteria. Again, quite straightforward, and there's an example of here on the right of how that might look in practice. And we can clearly see how this relates to the pass and merit and distinction criteria. So we're looking for a little bit more technical sort of subject terminology here. And again, it can still be quite basic at level 1. So it's, you know, it's sort of identify, use are the key words here. So again, it could be lists and bullet points. And if you remember from the assessment points, they don't need to cover all of those 6 areas. It was just 2 areas there. And again, the requirement for improvements is not needed at level 1. So I'll just pause for any questions before we move on to look at a sample of work.
Just having a check. Yeah, someone who's missed a start. Proposals. Can we have some examples of proposals for students to use for Learning Objective 1 or LO1? Sorry.
As far as I know, I don't think NCFE have provided any examples of proposals. However, there is an example. I think we call them examples. I think we call them sample portfolios. David, you might be able to remind me exactly the term. I think it's sample portfolios, and that's on the Qual Hub. So that's in addition, an additional sample, if you like, to this webinar that might have an example. If I remember rightly, I think there might be an example where students actually use some proposals there. But apart from that example, it's not something that I'm aware that they provide centres with. I don't know if those type of resources can be requested, David. I don't know if you can help to answer that. If it's something that might support centres, if they had some examples of proposals for that particular learning outcome. Is this the sample portfolio, David? I think, David, you might be on mute. We can't hear you.
Sorry, so I was. My apologies. Yeah. So
we didn't
just
actually
open
hear
up here.
anything there. We could see you navigating to the Qual Hub, and that's as far as we got. We didn't hear any response.
Okay. So the sample portfolios you're thinking.
So yes, I was just thinking if there was any examples in there of a proposal that learners have looked at. I think what I'm getting from the question is maybe not samples of learners' work, but actually examples of proposals that learners can look at in class, in the teaching and learning, in the lessons, and sort of the teacher can use as a guide. I think that's what you're talking about.
Okay, there might be possibly some in the teaching materials. I honestly haven't checked through all the teaching materials packs, but there's PowerPoint presentations that you can download for free from there.
There is. So I'm sure, again, I can't remember fully what's in those resources, but those resources are being created to basically support teaching and learning of delivery. So there might be some examples in those.
Yeah, I'm just having a look on here because you'll be certainly more familiar, understand how to produce a proposal to meet a brief. So
and the proposals look very different. Yeah, some learners like to do them very visual. Some learners like to do them more of a written response, and some learners like to actually present the proposal as well. And they might do a PowerPoint, but they might not actually stand up and do the sort of presentation, if you like, but they actually just create a PowerPoint as the evidence. I don't know if that's answered your question.
He says it would help for L1 so that students can have some examples of proposals to annotate and say what each section is for and how they can be improved.
Yeah, that's something we can feed back, David, do you think, to the to resources?
Yeah, certainly. I don't see why not.
I don't. I think that would be okay. I think that would be useful.
I'll just check if there's any other questions that have popped through there. Just thank you. That's okay. No problem. Well, like I said, we will feed that back, but do have a check in the teaching and learning packs. There might be examples of ones in there. I honestly, there's so much material on here. I haven't managed to do a deep dive into all of it myself.
Yeah.
But some of the sample portfolios, there's a Unit 2 sample portfolio on there as well. So do look at those resources out there for you. For
and
the
definitely
actual
the teaching and learning materials, because it might be more of a, there might be more of a chance that it'll be in those for that learning outcome one rather than the student sample. So definitely take a look in both.
And another question here, for the actual proposal, what do you expect it to be like? I mean, what do you consider as a proposal?
Well, a proposal, it can be, like I previously mentioned, it could be something in a Word document that they put together. So it could just have the headings, if you remember, of those assessment points. So they could just have a title, which it could be interactive media proposal, it could be themed towards the assignment brief that the student's being given. And then we would literally just expect those assessment points. That's the most common way we see it. And hopefully these examples will illustrate that a little bit further for you. And it can just be used as those sort of ideas generation, design, technical aspects, you know, functionality. It's just basically everything that the learner will need to produce in Learning Outcomes 3 to actually prepare to make the product in Unit 3. So it's like an intention, it's like documenting, this is what I need to do to create my website or to create my interactive PowerPoint, or I'm going to do an interactive game. This is what I'm intending to do based on the design brief, and this is what I need, the planning documentation I need to create it.
Hopefully looking at these examples might help to show that as well. That's the last question at the minute, so I think you're okay to show some of the...
Yeah, okay, I'll start to go through. So this particular learner has collated all of the evidence for the unit in a PowerPoint. Again, this is just one approach. We do see different approaches as well. Now they've decided to use this as the method to pull everything together. So within this particular portfolio, you'll see examples of photographs of things like sketches and notes taken from notepads and things. So they've just started it off with just the brief at the front that they're being given. And then that's just a reminder of the learning outcomes. And this has really just helped the learner to organise their work into the different parts. So again, the first learning outcome can be very much generated from some research that they've done just to try and find out what proposals are. So they've got a definition here, and they've also sort of started to explain what the purpose is. So they've got some relevance here to a pitch, understanding the requirement that it's to sort of persuade a client. And there's some examples here actually, so that was good to relate to that question before. I think that might be what the question was related to earlier. I think we've got a bit more of a mind map approach here. So again, they've started it quite using those assessment points really as a structure for this learning outcomes, because if you remember, the first one was ideas development, and it's just sort of explaining, describing why this part is needed within a proposal. And then they've related it to their own here. There's some good relation to target audience here. The reasons why they've made certain decisions. And again, they've sort of started off with saying who the audience is, why it's important in a proposal, why you should, you know, be planning your product towards a specific audience that's been stated by the client brief, and then they've actually started to talk about what they will do with their target audience here. And they've started to annotate some illustrations here. And again, they've used the next assessment point, which was technical aspects. And then the next assessment point, which was design aspect. And again, for design aspect, it doesn't have to be a written account. So some learners like to evidence this part quite visual. So they've talked about the importance of not just how a product may look, but it's also about how that information is communicated within that product. And they started to look at typography. Again, they've tried to relate it to the theme of their TV drama as well as their target audience. Colours and images. And if you remember level 2, they must reference about they must have reference to the functionality, so how the user will navigate. So again, they've got this evidence here, and that's not required at level 1, but this is a level 2 pass example. And again, they've started to talk about interactive content here, and again, that will reference how the user will navigate. They've got further consideration of the content here that wouldn't be interactive. So what that first learning outcome done is really has sort of explained each of the assessment points of what they are, but they've already started to relate it to their own product. And some learners actually don't even link it to their product at that stage in learning outcome 1. They would leave that until the proposal learning outcome 2, but it's absolutely fine. However they want to present that, that's okay. So this is where they've actually put together their proposal now based on their findings. So they've done some research, they've started to think about how they might relate those elements of a proposal, and they've actually put these together in a proposal document for Learning Outcome 2. And again, they've used those as the headings. And then we've got Learning Outcome 3, which is the planning documentation, the pre-production, if you like. So they've talked about the importance of planning, project management. And this is where they've actually used a combination of sort of handwritten notes. They've done some plans here, and then they chose to actually put this together in the PowerPoint presentation. They've got some screenshots here of some visual influences that they like or might like to use. And they've started to use those to produce some plans for their web pages, their layout. And then the final part, which is review. So they've got the review of the planning, sort of general strengths and weaknesses here. And then if you remember, the second part of that criteria is to review the proposal. So there's a review of both. And again, it's probably quite descriptive, quite straightforward, but again, we're only looking for a description is in the descriptor, even for past merit and distinction for learning outcome 4, and it's a consideration of the different areas. And then they've got some justification here with regard to the choice of product. And again, another example, but I think quite a useful way of sort of annotating their production, their planning. And then our evidence for feedback. So even something quite straightforward and basic here is fine for feedback. I'm just going to, I don't think there's been any questions, David, but shall we move on to merit? Just let me know if there's anything urgent coming, just conscious of time.
Yeah, that's fine. There doesn't seem to be any questions at the minute anyway, so
Okay.
good to go on to the merit work.
Okay, great. And then just to remind assessors that to get a merit for the unit, learners must have a merit for learning outcome 1, learning outcome 2, and learning outcome 3. So for example, if a student didn't do so well on the evaluation in learning outcome 4 and achieved a pass, but they got a merit for learning outcomes 1, 2, and 3, that overall unit grade would stay as a pass because they would need a merit in that learning outcome 4 to enable the overall unit grade of a merit. So that's just an illustration there. So just to remember, they need to get the overall merit, it must be a merit in all 4 learning outcomes. So again, similar approach, how they collated their evidence here. And I think the way this centre has allowed learners to sort of create their own PowerPoints, it's sort of allowed learners to be quite individual and quite creative of how they presented their evidence, and learners seem to respond well to that. Example of a proposal here. And they've got some written examples here. An example of a business one. Some content of here, what they think should be included in the proposal. And again, they've decided to do some explanation first before actually linking it in with their own ideas. So a slightly different approach to the previous learner. And then thinking about some formats of proposals. And then they've started to link it with the key elements that they found. So they're finding sort of from the research, if you like, of what they'll include in their own proposal. And then here, what they've got is some discussion, so a little bit more detail here regarding the features, and they've actually done some advantages and disadvantages here. So this would be where the higher end criteria would have been addressed here. So if you remember, for learning outcome 1, it was about making links to achieve higher than a pass. And again, I am going through this quite quickly just to illustrate the different approaches and how the criteria have been evidenced, but you will have time to go through this yourself in your own time. Again, they've started to link this now with their own target audience. Started to think here about software applications and tools and techniques that they need to use, platform of the project, design aspects. Again, they've considered some fonts that they might want to use. So lots of different assets there have been discussed, from audio, video, images, forums and links that they might want to include, polls on their actual product. So there's quite a lot of evidence here. Again, this is just one approach. So, you know, not every merit student will have produced as much of this in quantity. It's about the quality of where the criteria can be achieved for merit in you know, a much smaller presentation. It doesn't have to be in this approach. This is just one approach. And then they've started to make a little bit more decision-based here, decision-based evidence here. And then their actual proposal. So a lot of evidence there for learning outcome 1. And a very detailed proposal here. So they've collated, if you like, all of that evidence into one document for learning outcome 2, and then they've actually started to create the planning documents. Schedules, navigation, indication. Considered layout, button design. Some links to their drawings and other diagrams that they've used. colour scheme consideration, sourcing assets. So if they'll use existing, and here they've started to create some of their own assets as well. So they've got a combination of both here. And then we've got the review. So again, clearly addressed to planning. Justified the decisions that they've made as well in the review. So that will be covering those assessment points. So I do realise I did whiz through that and we did run out of time slightly at the end, but please do download the examples to have a look through in your own time there.
Thanks very much for that, Leslie. I'm just going to launch that poll and just see if there's any other questions that have come in at the moment. And as Leslie mentioned, please do download the handouts. Really good to have examples of those learner work. So I just want to check how confident you feel now after looking at some examples with regards to grading and assessing this learner work. So hopefully you should see that poll in front of you. Hopefully get some improvements, and if not, pop the questions into the chat box as well. And just in terms of other unit work, what I'm going to do is show you our YouTube channel as well. Looks like we got some those votes in. So I just want to make sure you have a chance to see this. So on our YouTube channel, we do have a playlist, training for schools and VCerts, and there are more interactive media ones there, including more Unit 2. So you might be able to look at other examples of Unit 2 work on there. So there's 2 previous Unit 2 webinars that you'd be able to look at, see more examples of learners' work, and so on. So just going to check if there are any additional questions that have come in. No, none at the minute. Well, I do hope then you have found this webinar useful, and do download those handouts. If you have any questions, you can contact me directly, davidkiernan@ncfe.org.uk, or if I'm unavailable, our general email address, curriculum@ncfe.org.uk. Meantime, though, I want to thank Leslie Davis. Thank you very much, as always, for your time. Very useful, very informative indeed.
Thanks, David. Thanks, everyone.
Yes, and everyone, please have a successful year, and most importantly, do stay safe. Thank you.